Soft music filled the air of the lavish reception hall, where guests toasted under a sky adorned with golden lights. Valentina smiled politely as her fiancé, Daniel, introduced her to a group of investors. She listened, shaking her head at the right moment, but her mind was elsewhere. Or rather, on someone else. There was something in the air that night, a restlessness that she could not name, a feeling perhaps. And then it happened. On the other side of the room, among the guests who laughed and toasted, one look met hers. It was only a second, but long enough for the world to turn in reverse. John. Valentina's heart stopped for a moment. Time seemed to slow down, dragging her into a past she swore was buried. John was there, a few feet away, holding a glass of whiskey with the same confident posture as always, but his eyes, those eyes said something else. She felt her legs wob. It couldn't be real. After so many years, after everything, he was there. Valentina. Daniel touched her arm, bringing her back. Are you okay? Yes, I just need of some air. She forced a smile and left before he could question her. The air in the balcony was fresh, but not enough to calm the whirlwind inside it. I never thought I'd see you again. The male voice, hoarse and unmistakable, sounded behind her. Valentina closed her eyes, trying to contain her emotions. When he turned, John was already there, too close. John ... His name escaped her lips like a whisper. He smiled, but it was a melancholy smile, loaded with untold stories. I still can't believe it's you, he said, after so long. Me neither. Her breath was held. What are you doing here? Business. But I think fate had another plan. The silence between them was thick, almost suffocating. Valentina felt her heart hammer. There were so many unspoken words, so many choked questions. But in the end, not a word was spoken. John stepped forward and she didn't back down. The air between them was electrified, as if the entire universe had pushed them towards each other. And then, without warning, he kissed her. It was a kiss unlike any other. There was no hurry, but there was no hesitation either. It was as if everything they had repressed for years exploded there, at that moment. Valentina should have backed down. I should have stopped that. But he couldn't. The world has disappeared. All that existed was the warmth of that moment, the memory of what they had been and what they could have been. When the kiss ended, they were both out of breath. She touched her own lips, still tasting him, still feeling life spin. I ... The words fail. John's eyes held hers like a dangerous secret. Now nothing will be the same. And deep down, Valentina knew he was right. Valentina hurried into the bathroom of the salon, closing the door behind her with a trembling sigh. His hands were still cold, but it wasn't because of the night wind. She touched her own lips, trying to erase the sensation of that kiss. But it was impossible. She stared at herself in the mirror. His eyes were wide, his breath short. His whole body seemed in shock, as if a part of her, buried long ago, had suddenly awakened. John. After so many years, he appeared as a ghost from the past to mess everything up. She should be happy with Daniel, building a solid and secure future. But at that moment, the only thing his mind repeated was the taste of that kiss. His cell phone vibrated in his bag. A message from Daniel. Where are you? Is everything okay? Valentina closed her eyes for a moment before typing a quick answer. I'll be right back. She threw cold water on her face, took a deep breath, and left the bathroom, trying to regain her composure. But he didn't have time to prepare. As soon as she stepped down the hallway, she saw John standing there, leaning against the wall, his arms crossed as if waiting for her. You shouldn't be here, she whispered, looking around to make sure no one would see them. He tilted his head, his eyes loaded with something Valentina didn't want to decipher. And you shouldn't have kissed me back. Her heart leaped in her chest. That was a mistake. Was it? John stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Because, to me, it seemed inevitable. The way he said that caused all the air to escape from her lungs. I'm getting married, John. And does that make you happy? The question was hovering between them. Valentina opened her mouth to answer, but nothing came out. The problem was not what John asked. It was what she couldn't admit to herself. Before she could find an answer, a voice echoed down the hallway. "Valentina?" She froze. "Daniel." John took a step back, but not before whispering, "This is not over yet." Then, he disappeared down the hallway, leaving Valentina alone with her confusion and a fiancé who was beginning to suspect that something was very wrong. Valentina turned quickly, forcing a smile when she saw Daniel approaching. But her heart was still racing, and she feared he would notice. "Here you are," he said, holding her hand. "I was worried. You're gone. Is everything okay?" She swallowed. "Yes. I only needed a minute to breathe. It's very crowded in there." Daniel studied her face for a moment, her blue eyes carrying the usual gentleness. But there was also a twinge of doubt. "Are you sure? You look a little far." Valentina laughed nervously and touched her face lightly. "I'm fine, just tired." Daniel seemed to accept her answer, but his hand squeezed hers more firmly. "Shall we leave then? I don't want you to feel uncomfortable." She hesitated for a second. John's kiss still pulsed inside her, like an invisible mark that didn't want to go away. Part of her knew she had to get out of there as soon as possible. The other part, he wanted to stay. "Yes, we will." On the way to the exit, her gaze involuntarily searched for John, and when she found him, she felt a shiver run through her skin. He was leaning against the bar, a glass in his hand, but his eyes were on her, only in it. His gaze was intense, full of silent promises and unspoken words. Valentina turned her face away quickly, but felt the weight of that look until the moment she got into the car with Daniel. That night, lying next to the man she planned to marry, Valentina couldn't sleep. Daniel's woody scent enveloped her, but all she could smell was the taste of John's kiss, the warmth of his hands on her skin, the way he looked at her, as if they still belonged together. She turned to the side, staring at the ceiling. What am I doing? He could not allow himself to think about it. He couldn't allow himself to feel that. But the problem was that, no matter how hard she tried, she was already feeling it. And on the other side of town, in a luxurious hotel room, John couldn't sleep either. The taste of Valentina was still on her lips, and a single certainty crossed his mind. He wouldn't leave without fighting for her. The sun had barely risen when Valentina woke up, or rather, when he gave up trying to sleep. The night had been long, and his mind revolved around a single thought. John. Turning slowly, she watched Daniel sleeping next to her, breathing peacefully. He was everything any woman could wish for, caring, affectionate, stable. His love for her was evident, but at that moment as she faced him, Valentina felt a twinge in her chest. She was lying to him, and for herself. He stood up silently and walked to the balcony, hugging his own arms as he looked at the still-awake city little by little. The cold wind brought back the memory of the kiss. Why did John have to show up? Why did he still have this power over her after so many years? His cell phone vibrated on the small table next to him. She picked up the device with trembling hands. "John, we need to talk." Her heart jumped. He stared at the screen, his fingers hesitating before locking the phone without responding. No, that was dangerous. She couldn't open that space. But then the phone vibrated again. "John, don't run away from me, Valentina." She exhaled hard and pressed the device to her chest. Part of her wanted to ignore him, pretend that nothing happened. But the other part, the part that trembled when remembering that kiss, I wanted to see him. And this part, unfortunately, was winning. Hours later, Valentina was in her office, but her mind was far away. "Val? Are you listening?" She blinked and looked at her best friend and assistant, Sophie, who stared at her with a smile of someone who already knew the answer. "I'm sorry." "What did you say?" "I told you you're completely airborne today." Sophie crossed her arms. "And considering I saw a certain ex-boyfriend at that party yesterday, I guess I can guess why." Valentina froze. "What? Have you seen John?" "Honey, anyone with eyes has seen it." Sophie leaned over the table. "Now tell me, what happened?" Valentina hesitated. Telling Sophie was risky, but she needed to let off steam. She ran her hands over her face. I kissed him. Sophie's eyes widened. What? Shh. Valentina looked around, making sure no one else was listening. Wait! Sophie took a deep breath. Did you kiss John? The John who broke your heart years ago? The John you spent years trying to forget? The same John? That's right, Valentina sighed, feeling the weight of guilt. And I don't know what to do. Sophie stared at her for a moment before grabbing a packet of cookies from her bag and opening it calmly. Well, she took a bite and chewed slowly. The first thing you're going to do is tell me everything in detail. Valentina snorted, but couldn't help but smile. Sophie, this is serious. I know. She chewed another piece. But before I give you advice on how not to destroy your relationship with Daniel, I need to understand exactly what we're up against here. Valentina looked at her cell phone again. John's message was still there, waiting for a response, and within it, a conflict grew more and more. Heart or reason, she had to choose. Valentina drove aimlessly, her heart pounding in her chest. John's words echoed in her mind, dismantling everything she believed she knew about the past. Your father. Would he have been capable of something like that? When he realized he was already in front of the house where he grew up, he entered without hesitation. He found his father in the office, surrounded by books and mementos of a man who was always strong, imposing. He looked up when he saw her. Valentina? What happened? She approached slowly, trying to stay calm. I want you to tell me the truth. His gaze remained serene, but the tension in his shoulders gave away that he knew exactly what she was talking about. About what? About John. About what you did to get him away from me. For an instant, silence filled the room. Then he sighed, running his hands over his face. I did what was necessary. Valentina's blood ran cold. Then it's true. You were too young, naive. That boy had no future. I've got your back. She felt a lump in her throat. Protect me? You destroyed something that could have been the best thing in my life. He kept his expression rigid. You're happy now, aren't you? She has a stable fiancé, a secure life. John could never have given you that. Valentina took a step back, feeling the weight of that betrayal. Her own father had decided for her, and now, everything was confused again. Valentina left her father's house feeling suffocated. The air felt heavy, loaded with memories and truths that I should never have discovered. He drove aimlessly without thinking, until he realized that he stopped in front of the hotel where John was staying. His heart raced. She shouldn't be there. But his feet had already made the decision before his mind could contest it. He went up the elevator and hesitated before the door of the room. I could just walk away, pretend that none of this happened. But before he could decide, the door opened. John was there, as if he already knew she was coming. I knew you would come, he said, his voice hoarse. Valentina swallowed. I went to talk to my father. John closed his eyes for a moment, as if he was already waiting for confirmation. So, you know? She nodded. I've spent years hating you, thinking that he left me because he wanted to, but it was a lie, all a lie. John watched her silently until he stepped forward and touched her face gently. Does that change anything? Valentina felt his touch burning her skin, awakening everything she tried to bury. I don't know, he whispered. But his body already knew the answer. John slid his fingers across Valentina's face, the touch light but loaded with a desire held back for years. She should step aside. Everything inside her screamed that this was a mistake, but instead, she remained there, vulnerable, exposed. Valentina. His voice was low, almost a whisper. Tell me you don't feel anything, and I'll leave you alone. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. How could he lie? How could she deny what burned inside her? John brought his face closer, his breath warm against his skin. Tell me, he insisted, his eyes fixed on hers. Valentina felt the tension vibrate between the two, as if the air itself carried the weight of the decision she needed to make. His body begged for him, for the memory of what they once were, but his mind still whispered Daniel's name. With superhuman effort, she closed her eyes and took a step back. I can't. John clenched his jaw, looking away. Why does Daniel love? She was slow to respond. Because I made a choice. He nodded slowly, but the sadness in his eyes was impossible to ignore. So is that it? Valentina wanted to say something, but it all seemed wrong. With her heart in pieces, she turned and left, leaving behind a past that deep down had never ceased to belong to her. Valentina drove without seeing properly, her eyes teary and her mind in conflict. Every beat of her heart seemed to echo John's words, every breath reminded her of his touch. But she had made her choice. I had said no, so why did she feel like she was leaving a piece of herself behind? When he got home, Daniel was waiting for him. "Where have you been?" he asked, his brow slightly furrowed. Valentina hesitated for a second, but soon forced a smile. "I needed to think a little." Daniel approached and held his hands. "You've been different since that party." She held her breath. "I'm just overwhelmed." He studied her face for a moment, then kissed her forehead tenderly. "I just want you to be happy, Val. If there's something wrong, tell me." The lump in his throat tightened. She wanted to tell her. Tell about the kiss, about what she discovered, about how everything inside her was in chaos. But he couldn't. "It's okay," he whispered. But as I said those words, I knew I was lying. For Daniel, for herself, to one's own heart. Valentina spent the night awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of her own decision. He had chosen Daniel. He had moved away from John. But why then did she feel as if she were betraying herself? In the morning, he left before Daniel woke up. I needed air. I needed to put my head together. But deep down, she knew exactly where her steps were taking her. When he arrived at the hotel, his heart was hammering. He went up to John's floor, hesitated for a moment, but then knocked on the door. John opened it almost immediately, as if he already knew she would be back. "Valentina." She didn't say anything. She just looked into his eyes, saw the same storm she felt inside her. "Say you're leaving now and I'll let you go," he whispered. But Valentina didn't leave. Before any rational thought could stop her, she pulled John close and kissed him. This time there was no blame. There was no doubt. Just the recognition of something that never ceased to exist. And at that moment, everything changed. The kiss was intense, full of urgency and reunion. Valentina surrendered to the moment, to what she always tried to deny. But when she walked away, reality fell on her like an unbearable weight. She was engaged, and now everything was even more complicated. John watched her, as if he knew exactly what was going on in her mind. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice full of emotion. Valentina had no answer. She wanted to stay, but she knew that her life was no longer hers alone. There was Daniel. There were promises made. The silence between Valentina and Daniel was dense, as if the very air was loaded with unspoken truths. He watched her, waiting for an answer she didn't know how to give yet. She took a deep breath. "Daniel, I wanted to say that none of this has changed how I feel about you, but it has changed." He looked away as if he already knew. "I always knew there was something in your past that was never completely resolved, but I believed that time and what we built together would be enough." Valentina felt her eyes burn. "You're an amazing man. But I need to be honest. I could never forget John." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment and then nodded. "So I only have one question, Val. Are you going because you feel you must or because it's impossible to stay?" She knew the answer. "It's impossible to stay." Daniel forced a smile, trying to hide the pain. "Then go, but go all out. Don't look back." The tears fell before she could hold them back. She came closer, held his hand for a moment, and then left, her heart racing but light. Valentina rushed to the hotel, her heart beating as if every second was precious. She climbed the stairs before the elevator arrived, out of breath, desperate not to waste any more time. When he knocked on the door, John answered immediately. His eyes widened to see her there, panting, emotional. "I chose you." He was paralyzed for a second, as if he couldn't believe his ears. "What?" "I chose you, John. It was always you." Without waiting for an answer, she kissed him, putting in that kiss everything that had been trapped for so many years. John held her tightly, responding with the same desperation. At that moment, the past ceased to be a burden. Now, everything was present. And finally, they were exactly where they should always be.